report.com. It's titled, "Can America Pull Off a Second Reconstruction?" And, you know, what got me started on this, what got me thinking about this, was the fact that in 2005, every single Republican in the United States Senate voted to reauthorize the Voting Rights Act. Every single one. And then in 2013, when it came up again, none of them did. What happened between 2005 and 2013 that caused every single Republican in the Senate to suddenly say, no, we don't need to protect black people's right to vote? My hypothesis, and I think I defend it well in this article, and I will defend that argument right now with you, is Barack Obama. What happened was we elected our first black president. Now, to understand the context and the importance of this, let's step into the Wayback Machine together and go back to 1868. It's, you know, in the years after the end of the Civil War, Reconstruction is going on. The South is occupied by Northern troops. And black people are allowed to vote for the first time in the history of the Republic in many of these states. There were some black people who were voting in northern states, particularly Delaware, you know, after the American Revolution. But by and large, by the 1820s, 1830s, even in those northern states, they were prevented from voting. Certainly, they had never had the right to vote in the South. And so what happened between 1868 and 1877, basically, was that a large number of African Americans got elected to positions of political office. Over 1,500 African American men were elected sheriffs, mayors, city council, state legislatures. There were over 600 African American men during that period of time, during that 10-year period from 1866 to 1876. Over 600 African American men elected to state legislatures, and 17 African American men elected to the U.S. House and Senate, 1 to the Senate and 16 to the House. This then produced in 1876 such an intense white backlash that in the election, and we've discussed this before in this program, the Rutherford Hayes versus Sam Tilden election of 1876, even though Sam Tilden won the majority of the popular vote and the majority of the Electoral College votes, Rutherford Hayes ended up president. How did that happen? Well, they cut a deal to stab black people in the back, to end Reconstruction, which, by the way, was what Tilden wanted to do. Tilden was the Democrat. He was like the pro-slavery Democrat, and he wanted to end Reconstruction, but the Republicans didn't want a Democrat in the White House after they had just fought the Civil War basically against the Democrats, the southern states back then. So the deal they worked out was that the Republican would stab black people in the back in exchange for letting him occupy the White House. That it's sometimes referred to as the Compromise of 1877, because it happened. I mean, the election was 1876, but it happened in January, the following, the 2 months later. It wasn't a compromise. It was a deal to sell out black people, period, full stop. And there was the response to white people being triggered by 1,500 black people holding elective office in a 10-year period. So Reconstruction came to a dead stop in 1877. The Northern troops were withdrawn from the South by 1878. And in 1896, the Supreme Court put this into law with their Plessy versus Ferguson decision, which said that separate but equal, that black people in theory had equal rights under the law, but not in practice. And that, of course, then started a half a century of black voter suppression, or voter suppression against black people. Which brings us to 1964, 65, and 63, basically, that period. The Kennedy and Johnson administrations. With the Voting Rights Act, the Civil Rights Act, several other pieces of legislation that confirmed the right of black people to vote in the United States. You combine that with the 1965 law that changed our racial quotas for immigration. And what started happening in the 1960s and really hit its stride in 2008, which is what I'm building up to here, what started happening was the browning of America. There was no longer a ban on black and brown people immigrating into the United States. So you had the ratio of, prior to that, over 90% of all immigrants were white, prior to 1965, I believe it was. And after that, it changed. The majority of immigrants were not white. On top of that, you had black people voting in significant numbers. I mean, really huge numbers. You had, like fewer than 7% of black people in Mississippi were even registered to vote because they couldn't prior to the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. Afterwards, that number crept up into the 30s and 40%, just in the decade afterwards. So what happened then was that by 2008, America is browning. I mean, keep in mind, this right now, we have an roughly equal number of black and brown kids coming into elementary school as white kids. The baby ratio changed about 5 years ago. And in 2008, this is the point. Prior to 2008, again, in 2005, every Republican in the Senate voted to reauthorize the Voting Rights Act. In 2013, every Republican in the Senate voted no. What happened? Barack Obama got elected president in 2008. That black man in the White House triggered the white racists across the United States who have concentrated themselves and their power in the Republican Party, triggered them so badly that the Republican Party's official position became, oh my God, voter fraud, stop the black people from voting. So here we are again. We are in what I'm referring to as our second era of Reconstruction. I realize that, the word Reconstruction had a very specific meaning, but I'm kind of redefining it here to mean a pluralistic, multiracial democracy. We tried it for 10 years, arguably 12 years, back in the 1860s and 1870s, and then the white backlash killed it. We tried it again between 1965 and now, and 8 years of a black man in the White House produced this mind-boggling white backlash that we saw in the Tea Parties and all these other efforts. And, now you've got hundreds, literally hundreds of laws have been passed in the last decade, and particularly in the last couple of years, making it harder for people to vote, particularly minorities, particularly people of color. So, the good news is that we are still in this period of our second Reconstruction. And the good news is also that the kids going into school right now, about half of them are people of color. And the good news is that the nation, we had Sam Lawrence on this show a week or two ago, a 19-year-old who's running for his state legislature. He's got a friend who's 17 who's also running for a state legislature. In fact, we should get him on. And he'll be 18 this before the election. And so we've got a generation coming up that is multiracial and that wants to embrace multiracial democracy. So what do? How do we pull this thing off? I think it's inevitable, number one. What we're seeing is the last gasps, although they're pretty damn violent gasps, of white supremacy and, supremacist ideology. But I think it's entirely possible that this second Reconstruction could actually be the moment